Hi, I'm George Gikollias. Welcome to the Gikollias podcast, where we talk about art, philosophy, literature, and all things classical Greek. In today's episode, we will be talking about Euripides' tragedy, the Bacchae. So, our topic for today is the Bacchae. That's Euripides' last tragedy, written while the great poet was living in Macedonia in the last year of his life. And the Bacchae was first shown in the city Dionysia festival in Athens in 405 BC, after the poet's death. The Bacchae is the story of the introduction of the cult of the god Dionysus to Greece and the resistance he met there. After successfully converting most of Asia, Dionysus returned to Thebes, the birthplace of his mother, Semele. He himself appears in the prologue of the play to tell us that the Thebans not only refused to honor him as a god, that is, perform sacrifices for him and mention him in the prayers, but they also insult the memory of his mother. They have spread the rumor that she invented the story that Zeus was the true father of her child to cover her own indiscretions. Dionysus has now come to Thebes disguised as a young mortal, and he has brought with him a Thyasos, a group of his female followers, the Menads or the Bacchae, that form the chorus of this tragedy and give it its name. He has also already caused the women of Thebes to leave their homes and take to the mountains and become Menads themselves, so they form an alternative Thyasos, if you wish, that we never get to see on stage. Chief among them are Semele's sisters, Agave, Ino, and Otonoi, who were actually the spreaders of the malicious reports against the god's mother. So, the city of Thebes, that is the men of the city and their leaders, now have to choose. Either accept the cult of the god peacefully and assimilate him in the official ritual calendar and practices, or go to war with him and his army of women, foreign and local. Interestingly enough, the two most senior authority figures of male Thebes have accepted Dionysus already. Cadmus, the founder of the city, father of Semele and grandfather of Dionysus, and Tiresias, the blind seer, who appears in most tragedies set in Thebes, although all other plays where he appears are set several generations after Cadmus, so the Bacchae, in presenting Cadmus and Tiresias together, are anachronistic in this respect. However, power no longer rests with them. Cadmus has passed the kingship of the city to his other grandson, Pentheus, the son of Agave. And from his first entrance in the play, Pentheus makes it clear that he's radically opposed to the introduction of the cult of his first cousin. He thinks he's a charlatan and a corrupter of women, and he's determined to crush him and his followers. He orders that the women from the mountains be arrested, and with them the young man who has been proselytizing them in the name of the god. The disguised Dionysus is now brought in front of Pentheus and does his best to convince his cousin to change his mind and follow him. He first tries calm persuasion. He also performs numerous miracles. For example, there's an earthquake rocking the palace and a fire burning in his mother's grave. Dionysus escapes from prison and frees all the Theban Menads as well. All of this simply reinforces Pentheus' determination to destroy the new religious movement. A messenger now appears from the mountains to inform the king on the escaped Theban Menads. They do not engage in sexual orgies as the king suspects, or perhaps fantasizes. They lead a pretty idyllic existence in perfect harmony with nature, in a fairy tale setting with a strong atmosphere of the miraculous. There's women breastfeeding young animals, having their faces licked by snakes, milk and wine springing from the rocks. However, when the Menads are attacked by the villagers, they turn wild. They go on a rampage, devouring cattle alive, and then they easily defeat the armed men who attack them. Pentheus, nevertheless, is adamant. He will lead his army in full force to the mountain against the women. Dionysus now makes one last attempt to reason with the king, and successfully. And here, there's a turning point in the play, signalled by a simple "ah," uttered by the god. Dionysus asks Pentheus if he would like to see the Maenads, and Pentheus replies that he would give anything to be able to see them. From then on, as if mesmerized, the king is a pawn in the hands of the god. And Dionysus, on the other hand, who so far in the play simply wanted to make the Thebans pay him the requisite honors, now turns vindictive and decides to punish and destroy his resistant cousin. Pentheus becomes the target of the god's rage. Pentheus puts on the uniform of the followers of Dionysus, so long flowing women's robes, a wig, and he also holds the traditional thyrsus, the ivory rod that was the symbol of the god. After parading through the city like this, he goes up to the mountains to spy on his mother, his aunts, and the rest of the women of Thebes. The women spot him and, led by Agave herself, literally tear him apart. In a harrowing detail, they toss his torn body parts to each other like a football or a frisbee. Agave returns triumphant to Thebes with her son's head stuck on the end of a pole. She's very pleased with herself, thinking she has killed a lion. She calls on the whole city, including her son, to admire her hunting prowess. Cadmus, the old king, also returns from the mountain himself, having painstakingly collected all the ravaged pieces of Pentheus' body. In what is known as the psychotherapy scene, he gently helps his daughter come back to her senses and to realize that she has murdered her son rather than a lion, and actually that she's holding his head in her arms. With good reason, this is one of the most famous and pathetic scenes in all of Attic tragedy. The god now appears in his full glory. He sends the royal family into exile. Cadmus and his wife Harmonia will become snakes, leading barbarian armies against Greeks, although eventually they will be transported to the islands of the blessed. We are missing certain key phrases from the text at this point, unfortunately, so there's a disagreement over whether the people of Thebes are also punished and sold into slavery, or whether they will be allowed to carry on, having accepted the god in the mist. Dionysus, in any case, makes it clear that if they had possessed the sense to show wisdom, they would have won the son of Zeus as their ally, and now know happiness. Agave leaves the city, expressing a wish to go as far away from Thebes and the Bacchic celebrations as possible. And here, the Bacchae ends. For his last play, Euripides went back to the origin of tragedy. Pentheus was actually the title of one of the plays of Thespis. Thespis was the semi-legendary figure who in the 6th century became the first Hippocrates, the first actor speaking back to the singing chorus, and thus practically invented tragedy. Furthermore, if the origins of theatrical performance lie indeed in ancient fertility rituals associated with the god Dionysus, then a story such as that of the Bacchae takes us all the way back to these primitive origins. And many elements of the play, human sacrifices, tearing animals apart and eating them raw, the nomadic wanderings of the god and his followers, are in fact linked with the mythology and presumably the prehistoric rituals of Dionysus. Even in historical times, we know that there were Bacchic gatherings of women in honor of Dionysus, usually held every 2 years in many places in the Greek world, including Thebes. Athens had no such festival, but occasionally delegations of Athenian women would travel to attend. And we can be sure that all such festivities would be closely monitored and regulated by the appropriate local authorities, and they would look like nothing like the chaos depicted in the play. In form, the Bacchae is much closer to traditional tragedy, say to the works of Aeschylus, the oldest of the 3 great poets, who had also written about Pentheus. We find here none of the technical innovations of the other late works of Euripides, say the overcrowded plots with the bizarre and barely credible twists. The chorus, who had almost become a singer of slightly irrelevant musical intervals, is now restored to a central position. Not simply a spectator, but another actor. In structure, the plot has a very archetypical form. It resembles a fairy tale. It's the story of a god who goes down among the mortals to test them. However, the question we need to ask here is, what is Dionysus testing for? There is no indications that the Theban have become unjust, inhospitable to strangers, or immoral. Their only transgression seems to be their delay in accepting Dionysus as a god. So we now come to a recurring theme in both Euripides and Greek tragedy and Greek thought in general, and even Plato has written a dialogue on that topic called Euthyphro. Are the gods the protectors of a set of moral standards that exists independently of them and that they perhaps even themselves are subject to? Or are the gods simply capricious and selfish beings who care only about their own honor and good name and the sacrifices offered to them? In the end of the play, Dionysus tells Cadmus that he, God, was treated with contempt. Cadmus replies that gods should not be like mortals in temper, to which Dionysus then replies, "Long ago my father Zeus gave his consent to this," which sounds a lot like saying, "Such is life, my friend, and you mortals better get used to it." And it is very interesting that exactly the same argument has been put forward to Pentheus by both Tiresias, the seer, and the first messenger who reports from the mountains. Both of them suggest to the king that humans have to obey the gods if they want to be happy. There's no point in trying to oppose them. Which brings us to a very interesting feature of this tragedy. At the very beginning, its plot seems to be more open than that of any other tragedy. Dionysus barely even mentions Pentheus by name. Pentheus at this point is not the god's enemy. Dionysus simply informs us that he has come to introduce his cult to Thebes and that he expects the Thebans to cooperate or else. In fact, during his first meetings with Pentheus, the god seems to make every effort to bring his first cousin over to his side, including saying, "I would sacrifice to him rather than a mortal fighting against the god," right before the turning point in the middle of the play. So, there are two things to note here. First of all, it is difficult to detect the workings of some blind fate that leads Pentheus inevitably to destruction. It would be very easy to imagine a scenario where at the beginning of the play, Pentheus returns from his travels, he's informed about the new god and his female followers requesting official recognition, and he simply says at the meeting with Tiresias and Cadmus, "You are right, let's include a festival for Dionysus in next year's calendar. Give the people an extra bank holiday as well." And the play would then simply end there, with a little traditional song and dance in honor of the newly established god. Furthermore, Pentheus is that unique example in tragedy where crime and punishment take place right before our eyes during the course of the play. In most other plays, we only get to see the suffering of the actors at the end of a long chain of cause and effect, whose beginning lies before the play, often many generations back. Here, arguably, Pentheus starts with a clean slate, and through his hamartia, his error of judgment, ends up being torn apart by his mother and her friends. Hamartia, error, is a concept we find in Aristotle's analysis of tragedy. And this play is a very good reminder that the term does not necessarily have the connotations of sin, of a moral deficit of some sort, that it only acquired after the introduction of a Christian point of view. Should Pentheus necessarily have been more welcoming to Dionysus and his Asiatic cult? Remember, he comes back from his travels to find out that his cousin, who everyone has been telling for years was the illegitimate son of his aunt Semele, and Semele presumably was the black sheep of the family, this cousin now calls himself the son of Zeus, a god, and expects to be honored accordingly. One could argue, of course, that had Pentheus been more open-minded and less rigid, he would have recognized the numerous indications that he had to take Dionysus seriously. For example, the miracles, the report of the messenger, the advice of his grandfather and the seer. He failed to do so at his loss. However, we know that at the end of the 5th century, along with the social turmoil caused by the Peloponnesian War, Athens saw a huge influx of similar mystical cults, mostly from Asia as it happens. So it is very possible that the arguments used by both Cadmus and Tiresias to convince Pentheus to accept Dionysus are very similar to some of the considerations aired in contemporary debates in the last decade of the 400s. Dionysus, of course, isn't just any god from Asia. He's associated with wine, festivals, the natural world, disguise, the theatre, and disruption of social norms. In fact, with all the forces that we may want to call savage as opposed to civilized. Many, therefore, have tried to read in the Bacchae a message to the effect that every community, like Thebes in the play, has two choices. Either accept the savage forces within the limits set by organized religion, with festivals, theatre and ritual, in safe, small, controlled doses, or run the risk that they will get completely out of hand. To use a 2021 topical reference, this analysis reads the Bacchae as a call for communities to vaccinate themselves with the Dionysus virus, to stave off a real epidemic of wild monadic madness, as depicted in the more gruesome sections of this play. Pericles, in his famous funerary speech in Thucydides, makes specific reference to the importance of festivals for civic harmony. He says, "We provide plenty of means for the mind to refresh itself from toil. We celebrate games and sacrifices all year round." And the point would definitely not be lost on Athenian spectators watching the Bacchae during one such festival, the city Dionysium. Pentheus himself is now considered to be a prime example of such repressed instinctual drives that burst in the end, although here we need to be very careful lest we try to project 20th century psychological models onto Attic tragedy. From the very beginning, Pentheus seems to be obsessed with the sexual character of the Maenads' activities, despite there being no indication of anything of the sort. Even after Dionysus assures him, "When you see what you do not expect, Bacchants behaving purely," he keeps nurturing expectations of open-air debauchery. "There they lie now, I fancy," he says, "like mating birds in the bushes, snuggling together in the joyous nets of love." His cousin Dionysus, with his beautiful androgynous looks and his suspected role as the seducer of women in chief, holds an obvious fascination for him from the very first meeting, a fascination perhaps with some erotic undertones. Admittedly, Pentheus' behavior in the second half of the play is the result of divine interference, because even Dionysus says, "For never in his senses will he agree to put on female clothing." But from Homer onwards, in Greek literature, there's always a double determination in human motivation and psychology. Even without tampering from the god, we think there's something very predictable in the image of a strict macho stickler for traditional morality and family values ending up in drag, overcome by voyeuristic desires that he simply cannot control. Finally, this play has also been called a self-reflexive study of tragedy. It deals with Dionysus, the patron god of drama. It talks about his cult, its introduction, its benefits on humans, the dangers if unleashed without control. Disguise also plays a major part. Dionysus is a god disguised as an acolyte of the god, who appears in his true splendor only at the end. In between, he has also appeared as a bull and as a phantom. All three senior male representatives of the city of Thebes, Pentheus, Tiresias and Cadmus, at some point appeared dressed as Maenads. And in fact, despite the Bacchae being one of the most tragic of tragedies, these examples of transvestism introduce an admissible comic element to the play, thus providing a link with comedy, the other major element in Attic drama, of which Dionysus was also the patron god. In the Bacchae, we get more detailed descriptions of the chorus, its dance, its movements, its appearance and its props than at any other tragedy. And the more sensitive viewers, either in the theatre of Dionysus in Athens in 405 BC or in modern productions in theatres around the world, will certainly appreciate the fact that it is Pentheus' passion for being a theatis, a spectator, that leads to his catastrophe. After Pentheus has expressed his wish to see the Maenads up close, Dionysus asks him the question, "And yet you enjoy looking at something that distressed you. And I think that we lovers of Attic tragedy have not stopped asking the same question of ourselves ever since. And this brings us to the end of today's episode of the Gikollias podcast on Euripides tragedy, the Bacchae. I'm George Gikollias. I would like to thank you very much for listening, and I hope to be able to speak to you again soon. Thank you and goodbye.